The morning sun, a painter of light, splashed through the colossal glass windows of Blackwood International, slicing the polished marble floors with long, dramatic shadows. Olivia Parker, a whirlwind of nervous energy, clutched her tablet like a lifeline, its cool surface a small comfort against her racing pulse. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the corporate headquarters, each turn deepening her sense of disorientation. It was her first day as the company's new lead translator, a position she dreamt of, yet the morning was spiraling into a comedy of errors. 10 minutes late for the crucial morning briefing, she was a woman possessed, her focus solely on reaching her destination. In her frantic dash, she barely registered the subtle signage, a blur of corporate jargon and directional arrows that meant nothing in her panicked state. The urgent and very human need for a restroom stop only amplified her growing anxiety. Spotting a door adorned with what she desperately hoped was a restroom symbol, a stylized figure that could just as easily have represented modern art, she pushed through without a second thought. The opulence that assaulted her senses should have been her first, blaring klaxon of warning. Instead of the sterile, utilitarian corporate bathroom she expected, she found herself enveloped in the hushed serenity of what could only be a private spa area. The air hung thick and heavy with the invigorating scent of eucalyptus, mingling with the faint, almost subliminal strains of classical music emanating from hidden speakers. Smooth, gray stone replaced the stark marble, and plush towels were neatly stacked on teak shelves. "This can't be right," she muttered under her breath, already pivoting to escape her embarrassing mistake. But fate, it seemed, had a script of its own to write. The gentle whoosh of running water ceased abruptly, leaving a pregnant silence in its wake. Before Olivia could execute a graceful retreat, a tall, imposing figure emerged from around the corner, seemingly sculpted from granite and raw masculinity. James Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood International, the man whose name was synonymous with power and success, stood before her, clad in nothing but a thick, absorbent towel. Water glistened on his broad shoulders, tracing paths down his chiseled chest. He looked like a god just risen from the sea. Time, as they say, seemed to grind to a halt. Their eyes met, locking in a silent, electric dance. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Recognition dawned on both their faces simultaneously, a shared moment of stunned realization. She had seen his photos, of course, in the glossy pages of company newsletters and the staid annual reports. But those carefully curated images were mere shadows, pale imitations of the raw, magnetic presence that stood before her. "This is a private executive spa," he stated, his voice a low, controlled rumble that belied the absurdity of the situation. "Care to explain why you're here, miss?" Olivia's mind, usually a well-oiled machine of linguistic precision, raced in panicked circles, desperately searching for a plausible explanation, some thread of sanity to grasp. I was looking for the restroom," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm new here, and I got lost." She gestured vaguely toward the door, her hand shaking slightly, trying desperately to keep her gaze fixed on his face, a feat of considerable willpower given the impressive landscape on display. "The employee restrooms are 2 floors down," he replied, his eyebrow arching in a silent question. "This floor is restricted access only." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I'm Olivia Parker, your new lead translator. It's my first day, and I was running late for the morning briefing." She trailed off, realizing she was rambling, digging herself deeper into a hole of mortification. A flicker of recognition crossed his features, a momentary softening of his steely gaze. "Miss Parker, you're the one with the impressive credentials from Geneva." Yes, sir," she managed to choke out. "Though right now, I'm feeling more like an embarrassed intern than a qualified professional." She attempted a self-deprecating smile, hoping to diffuse the palpable tension that crackled in the air between them. James's expression remained unreadable, a mask of professional detachment that betrayed nothing of his inner thoughts. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "The briefing starts in 5 minutes. I suggest you find your way to the correct floor and appropriate facilities quickly. Of course, right away. Olivia turned to beat a hasty retreat, but her heel, cursed betrayer, caught on the plush carpet, sending her stumbling forward. Instinct took over, and she reached out to catch herself, her hand landing squarely on James's chest. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, she felt the solid strength of him beneath her palm, the rapid thrum of his heart mirroring her own panicked rhythm. Their eyes met again, and this time, something undeniably electric, a spark of something forbidden, passed between them. James's hand had moved automatically to steady her, his fingers gripping her elbow with surprising gentleness. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, pulling away as if burned by a hot brand. "This is not how I planned to make my first impression." A hint of amusement, a fleeting ghost of a smile, flickered across his face, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "No, I suppose it wasn't. We'll discuss your navigation skills later, Miss Parker. For now, you have a meeting to attend." Olivia nodded, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and something she couldn't quite name. She practically fled from the room, her dignity trailing somewhere behind her. As she finally found her way to the correct floor and the bustling meeting room, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life at Blackwood International was going to be anything but ordinary. What she didn't see, as she disappeared around the corner, was James watching her leave, a thoughtful expression replacing his usual stern demeanor. For the first time in years, someone, had managed to crack the carefully maintained facade of indifference that he wore like armor. Whether that was a good thing, he wasn't quite sure. It felt like a challenge, a test of his self-imposed limitations. The following week proved that James Blackwood hadn't forgotten their awkward first encounter. Olivia found herself drowning in an avalanche of work, each task more demanding, more complex than the last. It became increasingly clear that he was testing her limits, pushing her to the breaking point, perhaps hoping she would crack under the pressure and simply disappear. A mountain of contracts, thick with legalese and obscure terminology, landed on her desk early Monday morning, accompanied by a terse, handwritten note in James's precise script. Complete by noon. No errors. The documents were complex legal agreements in German, Mandarin, and Arabic, requiring not just translation, but also careful cultural adaptation for each specific market. Olivia squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and dove into the work. She might have made a fool of herself in their initial meeting, but she hadn't earned her reputation as a top-tier translator by backing down from challenges. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion as she meticulously translated each document, cross-referencing industry-specific terms and ensuring that cultural nuances were preserved. She worked with a focused intensity, fueled by caffeine and a fierce determination to prove herself. At precisely 11:55 a.m., she walked into James's office, the completed translations held firmly in her hand. He looked up from his computer, his expression betraying a flicker of surprise before his usual mask of indifference settled back into place. "You're early," he remarked, accepting the stack of documents. "I allowed time for review," Olivia replied calmly, though her heart was doing a nervous tango under his scrutinizing gaze. James began examining the translations, his eyes scanning the pages with meticulous attention to detail. His expression grew increasingly frustrated as he failed to find any significant errors, any slip-ups that would justify his initial assessment of her as merely adequate. Finally, he set the papers down on his desk and fixed her with an intense stare that could melt glaciers. "Your technical skills match your impressive credentials," he conceded, his voice grudging. "But let's see how you handle pressure in real time." The next day, Olivia found herself thrown into a high-stakes video conference with Japanese investors, tasked with translating complex financial terms with absolutely no preparation. She maintained her composure, her voice steady and professional, even when James deliberately used obscure industry jargon, throwing linguistic curveballs to test the limits of her knowledge. As the days passed, the challenges grew exponentially more demanding. James would schedule last-minute meetings, requiring her to translate hours of dense technical discussions with little or no notice. He'd drop urgent documents on her desk moments before she was planning to leave for the day, his eyes watching with barely concealed interest as she tackled each seemingly impossible task without complaint. But Olivia wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her quick wit, her sharp intellect, and her remarkable adaptability began to earn her the respect of other executives, who noticed how seamlessly she could switch between languages, maintaining the nuanced meaning of complex negotiations. She became an indispensable asset, a bridge between cultures and a master of communication. One particular afternoon, during a crucial meeting with German investors, James was surprised to hear Olivia not just translating his words, but subtly improving them, adding layers of cultural context and smoothing over potential misunderstandings before they could even arise. She was anticipating the needs of both sides, a true diplomat of language. She did it with a finesse and grace that went far beyond mere translation. After the meeting, he summoned her to his office, his curiosity piqued. Olivia entered, expecting yet another impossible task, another test of her abilities. Instead, she found him standing by the window, gazing out at the cityscape, his usual stern expression replaced by something more contemplative, more human. "You altered my phrasing during the meeting," he stated, turning to face her. It wasn't an accusation, but an observation, a question hanging in the air. "I adapted it for cultural context," she corrected gently. The direct translation would have seemed too aggressive to German sensibilities. "I maintained your message while ensuring it would be received as intended." A ghost of a smile, the kind that rarely graced his lips, touched his mouth. Most translators wouldn't dare take such initiative. "Most translators haven't accidentally walked in on their boss in a private spa," she replied before she could stop herself, the words tumbling out with a nervous laugh. "I figured my career here couldn't get much more precarious." To her utter astonishment, James actually chuckled, a genuine, heartfelt sound that reached his eyes. The sound was rich and warm, completely transforming his usually severe features. For a moment, Olivia caught a glimpse of the man behind the corporate mask, someone younger, more approachable, than his carefully cultivated reputation suggested. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Parker," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The formality in his tone was barely there. Their eyes met, and that same electric tension from their first encounter crackled between them, a palpable force that hummed in the air. Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat as she noticed details she'd been trying to ignore. The way his tailored shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, the subtle flecks of gold in his deep brown eyes, the clean, masculine scent of his cologne that filled the air around him. The moment was abruptly broken by the insistent ringing of his phone, a jarring intrusion into their fragile connection. James turned away to answer it, his business persona snapping back into place with practiced ease. Olivia took the opportunity to retreat, to put some much-needed distance between them. But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Miss Parker." She turned back, her heart pounding. "Yes? Good work today." The words were simple, almost perfunctory, but coming from James Blackwood, they felt like the highest of praise, a hard-won victory. As Olivia walked back to her desk, a small smile played on her lips. She was beginning to understand that James's tests weren't just about proving her professional worth. They were his way of keeping people at a distance, of maintaining control. The question was, how long could he maintain that distance when she kept exceeding his every expectation, when she saw glimpses of the man beneath the armor? The answer, as it often does, would come sooner than either of them expected, bringing with it revelations that would shake the foundations of their carefully maintained professional relationship and force them to confront the undeniable attraction that simmered beneath the surface. The Charity Gala. The annual Blackwood International Charity Gala, a night of glittering excess and carefully orchestrated philanthropy, transformed the company's austere headquarters into a dazzling wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across the polished marble floors, illuminating the elegantly dressed guests who mingled and networked with practiced ease. The air hummed with the gentle strains of classical music, punctuated by the clinking of champagne glasses and the murmur of polite conversation. Olivia, feeling somewhat out of place amidst the sea of designer gowns and impeccably tailored suits, stood near the refreshment table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Her role for the evening was to assist with the international guests, ensuring that everyone felt comfortable and understood. But so far, the evening had been surprisingly quiet, a lull before the inevitable storm. She watched as James, the man of the hour, worked the room with practiced ease, moving from group to group with a calculated charm. He looked particularly handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, the crisp white shirt accentuating his strong jawline. But even from a distance, Olivia noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible clenching of his jaw, subtle betrayals that revealed his discomfort with such social occasions. He seemed like a caged animal, restless and longing for escape. The atmosphere shifted subtly when the waiters began circulating with trays laden with champagne flutes, their golden contents sparkling under the chandelier light. Olivia observed as James's entire demeanor underwent a dramatic transformation. His jaw tightened visibly, his knuckles turned white as he gripped his water glass with an almost desperate intensity. He seemed to shrink in on himself, retreating behind an invisible wall. When a waiter approached him, offering a glass of champagne with a polite smile, he recoiled, the movement so subtle that most wouldn't have noticed. But Olivia saw it, the almost imperceptible flinch, the flicker of something akin to panic in his eyes. She watched as he excused himself from his current conversation with a murmured apology and slipped out onto the balcony, seeking refuge from the suffocating atmosphere of the gala. Without really thinking about why, acting purely on instinct, she followed him, drawn by an invisible thread of concern. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome respite from the artificial warmth of the ballroom. The scent of blooming jasmine drifted up from the corporate gardens below, a fragrant balm to soothe the senses. James stood at the railing, his back rigid, his breathing slightly uneven. He didn't turn when she approached, but she knew he was aware of her presence, his senses finely attuned to her every move. "You should be inside," he said, his voice rougher than usual, the carefully cultivated CEO persona momentarily abandoned. "There might be guests who need translation." "They can wait," Olivia replied softly, stepping closer but careful to maintain a respectful, professional distance. She moved to stand beside him at the railing, her gaze fixed on the twinkling lights of the city skyline. "What is it?" He hesitated, his silence heavy with unspoken pain. About the champagne," she clarified gently. He turned to her sharply, his eyes wide with surprise and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "You noticed that?" "I notice a lot of things about you, James," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper in the night air. "It's part of my job to read people, to understand what's not being said." James was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, haunted, as if coming from somewhere deep in the past, a place he rarely allowed himself to visit. "5 years ago, I was at a gala much like this one," he began, his words carefully measured. "My wife, Rebecca, was there, and our daughter, Emma." He paused, his hands gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles shone white in the moonlight. "We were celebrating a major merger, a deal that was supposed to secure our future. Everyone had champagne." He closed his eyes as if trying to block out the memory. "I was giving a toast when we got the call." His voice broke slightly, a chink in his armor. "There had been an explosion at one of our research facilities." Olivia's heart clenched with a cold dread as she began to understand the source of his pain, the reason for his aversion to champagne. "Your family," she whispered, her voice filled with sympathy. "They found evidence of sabotage, a rival company trying to steal our research data," he continued, his voice raw with emotion. "The explosion was meant to be a distraction, but something went wrong." He swallowed hard, fighting to maintain control. "I was here, raising a champagne glass, while my family was." He couldn't finish the sentence, the words choking in his throat. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, Olivia reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing, her fingers gently covering his. His skin was cold, almost clammy, but he didn't pull away, didn't flinch from her touch. "That's why you push everyone away," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. "Why you test people so hard, why you refuse to let anyone get close." He turned to look at her, and in the soft moonlight, she could see the raw, unfiltered pain in his eyes, the deep-seated grief that had haunted him for years. "The merger partner was behind it all, someone I trusted, someone I considered a friend." His voice was barely audible. "After that, I learned that trust is a luxury I can't afford. But it's killing you inside, James," Olivia whispered, her voice filled with compassion. "Living without trust, without connection. It's not really living at all." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, all the barriers between them seemed to dissolve, the carefully constructed walls crumbling to dust. James looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not as his employee, but as a woman, a human being who understood his pain. His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining almost of their own accord, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing between them. "How do you do that?" he asked, his voice barely audible, laced with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Do what?" "See through every wall I put up. Understand things I've never said." Olivia felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold his intense stare without flinching. "Maybe because I'm not trying to see the CEO of Blackwood International. I'm just seeing you, James." He drew in a sharp breath at the sound of his first name on her lips, the intimate familiarity of it sending a jolt of electricity through his system. They stood there, hands joined, hearts beating in sync, while the party continued inside, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding on the balcony. It was a moment of perfect understanding, of walls crumbling and truths being revealed, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of shared pain. But then, a burst of laughter, loud and jarring, echoed from inside the ballroom, shattering the delicate spell that had enveloped them. James pulled his hand away from hers and stepped back, creating a physical distance between them. His professional mask slid back into place, the CEO persona reasserting itself with practiced ease. Yet something had changed, something fundamental. Olivia had seen behind the mask, had touched the real man beneath it, and he, in turn, had allowed her to glimpse his vulnerability. As they returned to the gala, separately, both knew that their relationship had shifted irrevocably. The question was no longer whether they could maintain professional distance, but whether they could survive the inevitable collision of their personal and professional worlds, a collision that promised both exhilaration and potential destruction. Paris interlude. The Paris business trip wasn't supposed to be complicated. 3 days of negotiations with French investors, standard contract reviews, a few carefully planned dinners, and then back to New York. But from the moment their private jet touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, a strange energy permeated the air, a sense that something profound was about to unfold. Something felt different between Olivia and James, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of their relationship. Perhaps it was the lingering effect of their deeply personal conversation at the gala, the shared vulnerability that had stripped away their carefully constructed defenses. Or maybe it was simply being away from the familiar confines of Blackwood International, the escape from the relentless pressure of corporate life that allowed them to see each other in a new light. Whatever the cause, the careful distance they'd maintained with such diligence began to crack, the facade of professionalism slowly eroding under the influence of the City of Lights. The first day of meetings went smoothly, almost deceptively so. Olivia's French was impeccable, her fluency a testament to years of dedicated study and a genuine love for the language. She navigated the cultural intricacies of European business with practiced ease, charming the French investors with her wit and her ability to anticipate their needs. James found himself watching her more than he should, his attention drawn to the graceful way she shifted between languages, the subtle nuances of her expressions, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that he rarely saw in the corporate world. He found himself captivated by her, drawn in by her intelligence and her quiet strength. He was also keenly aware of the subtle way she anticipated his needs before he could even voice them, a silent understanding that spoke volumes about their growing connection. It was during a brief break between meetings that Thomas Lauren, one of the French executives, a man known for his charm and his appreciation of attractive women, approached Olivia. His interest was blatant. His flirtation barely veiled beneath a veneer of professional courtesy. He showered her with compliments, praising her language skills, her intelligence, and, of course, her beauty. James, watching from across the room, his jaw tightening imperceptibly, felt a surge of possessiveness he hadn't anticipated. He didn't like the way Lauren was looking at her, the way he lingered too close, the way he seemed to be deliberately ignoring James's presence. "Mr. Lauren seems quite taken with you," James commented later, as they rode the elevator to their rooms in the luxurious hotel. His tone was carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the possessiveness that churned within him. But Olivia didn't miss the subtle tension in his voice, the almost imperceptible edge in his words. "He's just being typically French," she replied, studying James's reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator. "All charm, no substance." She smiled faintly, a knowing look in her eyes. "Besides, I can handle myself." Before James could respond, the elevator shuddered violently, a sudden, jarring movement that sent a jolt through their bodies. The car lurched, groaned, and then ground to a halt with a sickening thud. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging them into near darkness, replaced only by the dim, ethereal glow of the emergency lighting, casting everything in an eerie blue hue. "Perfect," James muttered under his breath, his voice laced with frustration. He reached for the emergency call button and pressed it firmly. The response was quick, but not particularly encouraging. A voice crackled over the intercom, informing them that there was a citywide power issue, a major blackout that had affected a large section of Paris. It would be at least an hour, possibly longer, before they could get the elevator moving again. Olivia leaned back against the wall of the elevator, trying to steady her breathing, fighting back a wave of claustrophobia. "Well," she said, forcing a light tone, "this is familiar." James raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, the last time I was trapped in an enclosed space with you, I was the one intruding on your private time." She blushed slightly, remembering the mortification of that first encounter. James's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, a rare and precious expression. "You've certainly made a habit of ending up in enclosed spaces with me, Miss Parker. At least I'm fully dressed this time," she quipped, then immediately regretted her impulsive remark. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." "You apologize too much, Olivia," he said softly, using her first name for the first time outside of a moment of intense emotion. He moved to stand beside her, the close proximity making the elevator feel even smaller, even more confining. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of the emergency lights. But Olivia could feel the tension building, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between them. There were too many things left unsaid, too many moments of almost something that had never quite materialized, too many feelings simmering beneath the surface. "Why did it bother you?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "What?" James feigned ignorance, avoiding her gaze. "Lauren," she clarified, her voice soft but insistent. "Why did it bother you, the way he was flirting with me? I saw your expression." James turned to face her, his eyes intense in the dim light, his emotions swirling beneath the surface like a turbulent sea. "You know why, Olivia, do I?" Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it, a frantic rhythm that echoed the anticipation that coursed through her veins. He moved closer to her, closing the remaining distance between them, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, a heady mix of spice and citrus that made her head spin. "Ever since the day you walked into that spa," he said, his voice low and husky, "you've been breaking down every wall I've built, dismantling every defense I've erected. And the most infuriating part is that you don't even seem to realize you're doing it." "James," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. But he wasn't finished. He had too much to say, too many emotions to unleash. "I tried to push you away," he confessed, his voice raw with honesty. "Gave you impossible tasks, tested your limits, looked for any flaw, any weakness, that would give me a reason to keep my distance. But you exceeded every expectation. You saw through every defense. And now," he paused, searching for the right words, the words that would capture the complexity of his feelings. "And now," she whispered, her eyes searching his, desperate for answers. Instead of answering, he reached up and gently traced her cheekbone with his fingertips, the simple gesture sending a shiver of electricity through her body. Olivia's breath caught in her throat at the tenderness of his touch, the unexpected vulnerability in his eyes. This was James Blackwood, the man who never showed weakness, the man who never revealed his emotions, the man who had built a fortress around his heart. Yet here he was, looking at her with such raw, unfiltered emotion, such palpable vulnerability, that it made her heart ache with a mixture of empathy and longing. "I haven't felt anything for anyone since I lost my family," he admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to. It was easier to be numb, to focus only on the company, to keep everyone at arm's length, to protect myself from further pain. But you—" He drew in a shaky breath, his eyes locking with hers. "You make me want to feel again, and that terrifies me." Olivia reached up and covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek, her skin soft against his rough palm. "Being scared of feeling doesn't mean you stop feeling, James," she said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "It just means you're brave enough to recognize what you're risking." The space between them seemed to dissolve, the invisible barrier that had separated them for so long finally crumbling away. James's free hand found her waist, drawing her closer, his fingers pressing into the small of her back. Olivia's fingers curled into the lapels of his suit jacket, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. They were breathing the same air, sharing the same heartbeat, lost in a moment of profound connection. The final test. The merger negotiations were supposed to be routine, a simple matter of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Blackwood International was acquiring a smaller tech company, a move that would solidify their position as a leader in the industry. Everything had been proceeding smoothly, the paperwork in order, the terms agreeable. But as Olivia sat beside James in the sterile conference room, her senses heightened. Something felt off, a subtle discordance that set her teeth on edge. Something about the way the other company's CEO, Richard Morrison, kept smirking during the discussions, a smug, self-satisfied expression that didn't quite fit the situation. Their dinner in Paris had changed everything between them, forging a bond of intimacy and trust that transcended their professional roles. Though they maintained a strict facade of professionalism at work, adhering to the corporate code of conduct, subtle glances and brief, stolen touches betrayed the depth of their growing connection. They were careful, discreet, but the electricity that crackled between them was undeniable, a silent language that only they could understand. But today, that connection, that unspoken understanding, would prove more valuable than either of them could have imagined. As Morrison presented his company's financials, a seemingly innocuous collection of charts and graphs, Olivia noticed something in the German correspondence, a subtle pattern in the coded language that made her blood run cold. She had been translating documents all week, poring over countless pages of technical jargon and legal clauses, and certain phrases kept appearing, repeating themselves in different languages. Phrases that seemed innocuous on the surface, mere business terminology, unless you knew what to look for, unless you understood the hidden meanings embedded within the text. While translating Morrison's seemingly benign words into Mandarin for the Chinese investors present in the room, Olivia carefully and discreetly passed a note to James, her hand trembling slightly as she slid the small piece of paper across the polished conference table. "Need to speak privately. Urgent." James's expression didn't change, his face remaining an impassive mask. But he subtly nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment, a silent communication that conveyed both understanding and concern. Without missing a beat, He calmly called for a brief recess, citing the need to review some minor details. In his private office, the door securely closed behind them. Olivia's hands trembled as she spread out the documents on his desk, pointing to specific phrases, specific patterns, that had set off alarm bells in her mind. The coding in these contracts, she explained, her voice tight with anxiety. It's familiar. They're similar to what the investigators found in the documents from 5 years ago, the ones from the merger that... She hesitated, knowing how painful this would be for him, knowing that she was about to reopen a wound that had never truly healed. The one that killed my family, James finished for her, his voice tight with suppressed rage. His eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening with suspicion. Are you certain, Olivia? Yes, she replied, her voice firm, unwavering. Morrison's company, it's a shell corporation, a front. The same people who were behind the sabotage 5 years ago. They're back. They're trying to gain control of Blackwood International from the inside. James's face went pale, then hardened with fury, his features contorting with a mixture of grief and righteous anger. They've been planning this for years, he said, his voice barely a whisper, laced with a barely controlled rage, waiting for the right moment to strike, to exploit my vulnerability. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sudden impact rattling the papers and making Olivia jump. I should have seen it. I should have recognized the signs. Olivia reached out and touched his arm gently, her touch a comforting presence in the midst of his turmoil. You couldn't have known, James? She said softly, her voice filled with compassion. You were blinded by grief, by the need to protect yourself. But we can stop them now. We can expose their treachery and prevent them from causing any more harm. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing her not just as his employee, not just as a woman he was attracted to, but as a partner, an ally, a trusted confidant. And as he looked at her, something shifted in his expression, a softening of his hardened features, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. We? He questioned, the word laced with surprise and a hint of vulnerability. Yes, Olivia replied, her voice firm and unwavering. We. You're not alone anymore, James. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. She squeezed his hand, her touch conveying a silent promise of unwavering support. And I have a plan. When they returned to the conference room, the atmosphere had changed subtly, a palpable tension hanging in the air. James began speaking about the merger terms, his voice calm and controlled, but his eyes blazing with an inner fire. Olivia, as always, translated his words into multiple languages for the international investors present, but her translations were now carefully crafted, subtly exposing the hidden meanings embedded within Morrison's seemingly innocuous phrases, revealing the coded messages that lay hidden beneath the surface. Morrison's smug smirk began to fade as he realized what was happening, as he watched the investors, who had initially been nodding along in agreement, start to exchange uneasy glances, their faces slowly registering dawning comprehension. The international investors, recognizing the coded phrases that Olivia was cleverly highlighting, began whispering among themselves, the subtle murmurs growing into a crescendo of suspicion and unease. Is something wrong, Mr. Morrison? James asked, his voice deadly calm, his eyes fixed on the other CEO's face. You look uncomfortable. Morrison's face contorted with rage, his composure finally cracking under the pressure. You have no proof of anything, he spat, his voice laced with venom. This is all just speculation, baseless accusations. Actually, Olivia interjected, her voice calm and steady, sliding forward a neatly organized stack of translated documents. We have proof in 6 different languages. Every coded message, every hidden clause, every connection to the shell companies involved in the incident 5 years ago. It's all here, meticulously documented and translated. The room erupted into chaos. Morrison, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him, tried to flee the room, but was swiftly stopped by security guards, who had been discreetly stationed outside the door. The international investors, outraged by the deception, demanded explanations, their voices rising in anger. James calmly presented the evidence, laying bare the intricate web of deceit and conspiracy that Morrison had woven. The authorities, who had been quietly summoned to the scene, took over the investigation, collecting evidence and questioning witnesses. Hours later, after the dust had settled, the statements had been given, and the authorities had taken Morrison into custody, James found Olivia in her office, still there, long after everyone else had left, organizing the evidence for the ongoing investigation, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. He closed the door behind him, creating a sense of privacy, a sanctuary from the chaos that had consumed their professional lives. "You saved my company, Olivia," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved Blackwood International from falling into the hands of those who sought to destroy it." "I saved more than that, James," she replied, turning to face him, her eyes shining with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "I saved you from letting them hurt you again, from being consumed by your grief and your anger." James crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his embrace a silent expression of gratitude and affection. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back, no fear of vulnerability. His lips found hers in a kiss that spoke of gratitude, admiration, and something much deeper, a connection that had been forged in the crucible of shared pain and unwavering trust. When they finally parted, breathless and slightly dazed, James rested his forehead against hers, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter. "When you first walked into that spa, Olivia," he confessed, his voice husky with emotion, "I thought you were going to be nothing but trouble, a disruption to my carefully controlled world." Olivia laughed softly, a light, airy sound that filled the room with warmth. "I was the best kind of trouble, James." His expression grew serious, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion she had never seen before. "I spent 5 years building walls, convinced that letting anyone get close would only lead to more pain, more heartbreak. But you, Olivia, you didn't try to break down those walls. You simply showed me that it was safe to open the door to let someone in." "And now?" she asked, her heart racing with anticipation, her voice barely a whisper. "Now I'm done hiding, done being afraid to feel," he said, his voice filled with conviction. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheekbones.